I'm sitting in front of the Beetlejuice Dollhouse. This is where it lives. I don't know if you've seen one of my studio tours, but it's kind of in a different part of the studio, so I thought I'd do the introduction over here. After last week's incredibly technical video, where we even used a protractor, I wanted to do something a little bit more, how do I say this? Freeform, or no, not freeform. Anyway, I don't know how to state that, but last week was very technical. This week is going to be a lot of sculpting and painting, and sometimes I just need to vary up what I'm doing so I can remain excited about miniatures. The last time I worked on this project, I made walls and I created the fireplace. I am going to be painting the Beetlejuice fireplace, which means I'm also going to be painting a few walls. And then I want to try and create the little creepy dude that comes out, the little wedding officiant. He's going to come out of the fireplace. I definitely want him in my project, and I love sculpting. I don't feel like I get to do it often enough, so I'm going to be sculpting him from paper clay. I also ordered some green lights, so instead of me putting green lights as After Effects in Photoshop, I want to really try and light up the fireplace so it looks like it should, or it looks like it does in the movie. It's time to get to work. It's time to get to work. You have a lot to do today. That was disastrous. I will link the video where I built this part of the fireplace in the description box below if you want to check it out, but I'm very thankful that I did all of the construction work ahead of time, so now I can just focus on painting it. I didn't glue the pieces together because I knew this was going to be an easier way to get to all the surfaces, so now I can just remove all the tape, and I'm going to start by sanding the surface of the foam board. Even though you won't really see this part of the foam board that's outside of the brick texture, I do want to paint it black in case you do get a glimpse inside. That way it doesn't like glare out as just white material that doesn't have a finish on it. I'm going to be painting everything black. That includes the brick, and this is because I want very dark grout lines in between each brick. I'm using a mixture of colors including red, brown, and a little bit of orange. I'm starting with the red color, and I'm just going to lightly brush that on top of the brick texture, trying to avoid getting any of it in the grout lines. Because the black base coat is so dark, it does fade quite a bit, but as I got closer to the broken brick area, I tried to make sure that the red was deeper, or I guess brighter, in those areas. This is another reason I decided to use the orange, because I knew that would stand out and be a little bit brighter on top of the red. Next, I'm using some brown just to make the brick look like it's a little bit older, and as I'm adding each new color, I'm using less and less of it because I don't want to cover up all the color I put on previously. These colors eventually start to mix on my palette, and I'm taking that mixture of color and putting it on the edges of the brick so it looks as though they have color as well. Once I'm happy with the overall look, I'm just dabbing a very small bit of white onto a paper towel. I'm making sure it's mostly wiped off the paper towel and then dabbing it on top of the brick. I think this helps make it look like it's very old brick, and when the green glow starts coming through, those white highlights will really grab that color. Now I can work on the next layer, which is going to be the fireplace area that pops out from the wall. You're not going to see this behind area, but again, I'm painting it black just in case you do get a glimpse of it at some point, or there's like extra shine that comes from the light bouncing off the white. I want to paint it black just because this would be a very dark area. Once that's painted, I can go ahead and glue it on permanently, and I'm using my 1, 2, 3 blocks to make sure it all glues flat. To cover the sides, I'm going to be using poster board. Sometimes I use cardstock, but poster board is a lot thicker, and you can tell by the way it sounds. This is going to go on the edge of the fireplace, and this is going to cover up the exposed foam board edges you can see after I constructed the wall. I want it to look as smooth and as uniform as possible, as though it is an actual dry-walled wall, so covering it in this way will help before I start the painting process. I'm adding quite a bit of glue to make sure that it glues down very well, because if I have any gaps where there isn't glue, that is a possibility where it could warp once I start adding the paint. If I have any edges that overlap, I'm just going to sand it down with some sandpaper, and I do sand the edges anyway, even if it matches perfectly, because I think it helps blend the two pieces into each other. This side you can see doesn't have it covered yet, but then I covered it, and now we have what looks like a cohesive wall piece that was built and covered in drywall. I'm going to be spray painting these walls just like I did the very beginning walls of the Beetlejuice project so that they match. So I need to cover the brick so that I don't get any spray paint on it. I'm also going to be spray painting a blank piece of poster board so I can kind of use it as a wallpaper later on so I don't have to completely cover my project. I covered up the magnets because I don't want spray paint on the magnets either. And now I'm prepared to go out and spray paint. Although I don't think I mentioned this, but we are experiencing freezing rain at the moment. Thankfully, I could do this in the garage and I survived. I painted the texture on first, the texture spray paint, and then I added the gray color spray paint on top. That's how I did the original walls, and so that's why I'm doing it this way now. Here's the reveal of how the wall looks in front of the brick. Now I can work on this top part, which is going to be the mantle itself for the fireplace, which is arguably the most iconic part of the living room throughout this movie. I made this out of some foam, and there was a little bit of tearing that happened when I cut it, so I'm going to first fill it with some drywall compound so that it's as smooth as I can get it. There were a few other gaps that I had to fill, and I cut off some excess chipboard that was on the back, but after that it was ready to get its first layer of Mod Podge. I'm going to be doing 3 or 4 layers of Mod Podge, and I'm sanding in between each time. The reason I'm doing this is because the foam board that I exposed and carved into has a very distinct texture, and I'm okay with it having a little bit of texture. It does end up looking kind of marbled and a little bit mottled, but I didn't want it to look like foam, so that's what I'm trying to get rid of. I am also making sure in between each time I add Mod Podge to go back with an embossing tool and make sure I have those signature markings that are in the original design of the mantle. Once I have as many layers as I'm happy with, I am going to do a base coat of black paint. This is just going to allow me to start with a very dark layer and build colors on top of it. This base coat does allow you to see the texture that I was working with that comes with the foam. If I had really wanted to make this smooth, I probably would have done a layer of drywall compound over the top to smooth it out as much as I could, but I'm okay with the texture. To start, I'm going to be adding another base coat of gray. It doesn't have to completely cover it. I am okay with a little bit of the black showing through. I'm mixing together some green and blue, and then I am very carefully going to be knocking over my paint all over my desk. I'm then going to be cleaning it up and then knocking it over again, making sure that I waste as much paint that I mixed as possible. It's a very important part of the process. Once I get it together, I can go ahead and start painting this green mixture over the gray base layer. You will see that I'm trying to do mostly downward strokes, and that's because in the movie there is a very paint strokey look to the mantle, and I don't know if this is because it's stretched during the scene or what the idea behind that was, but I wanted to make sure and try to get that look as best as I could. I added a little bit more blue paint into my previous mixture, and then I dry brushed that. Well, it's not really dry brushing because there's a lot of water in this mixture, but I put it on top of the green and tried to make sure that you could still see some of the green underneath. I'm adding a little bit more of this to the inside opening of this wall because it will be something that you can see beyond the mantelpiece, so I'm just adding some of these colors just so it blends in a little bit more once I add it on. My final layer is going to be a watered down black paint, and I know it kind of looks like I'm ruining it at the moment, but this will fade quite a bit, and you can see that I'm dabbing it anywhere I think I got a little bit too much on. But this is going to help me get that brush stroke look that I'm going for, and I'm adding it all on, and then I'm drying my brush and I'm running my dry brush through the black paint. This is picking up some of the paint that I already put on, leaving these very distinctive strokes so that it looks like there are lines going up and down on the mantle. I'm now going back with some more watered down black paint, and I'm carefully placing that into the carvings that are on either side of the mantelpiece. This watery paint mixture is just going to sit in these areas while I let it dry underneath a fan. It's going to be lighter than it looks now, but it will help highlight these important markings. Once the mantle has completely dried, I can go ahead and add it to my wall. I could have marked off the area where I was going to glue this and not allowed there to be spray paint. But since I didn't do that, I'm going to sand that area to make sure it has enough chance to hold on. I do think it'll hold on pretty well because there's texture and the spray paint was not coming off easily when I was sanding it. So hopefully this will be a forever hold. I am going to allow that glue to dry for as long as I can underneath some 1, 2, 3 blocks. And now I can do the final reveal where you can see the mantle, the wall, and the bricks behind it all. Before I had put the mantle on permanently, I had flipped over to the back of the wall and I cut an opening. The reason I needed to do this is because I do want to add green lights into the interior of the fireplace. This is going to be the exterior chimney of the house, and it's not looking great now, but I hopefully will be able to make it look a little bit better in the future. I purchased a roll of green LED lights. These are strip lights, but you can cut them apart. And this is going to be really important because I do need green lighting in several different parts of the project. It does have one plug that's already wired to the lights. So what I'm going to be doing is cutting off maybe like a foot or so, something that will fit in this area. And then later on, when I want to use more of those lights, I will have to figure out how to solder on another plug so that I can plug it in somewhere else. So I'm going to return these to the bag they came in, put them in the box for later use. Here is how many lights I cut off and the plug. So I'm just going to temporarily kind of squish these into the hole that I cut in the back of the chimney area. You will be able to see them a little bit on the front because they're not permanently in place, but that is okay. This is just so that we can see how it would look once it's done. I think the green coloring of this is just perfect and I am so excited. Of course, right away I had to take a picture of it because this was, just very iconic Beetlejuice. It was kind of a moment. It was a moment for this project. You may remember I mentioned I was going to spray a poster board amount of spray paint with this texture and gray color. This is how it came out. So I basically have this gray textured wallpaper that can now go into my house. This is going to go on either side of where this fireplace magnet wall goes. This was so much easier than trying to mask off my entire dollhouse just to spray 2 small walls. I'm thinking I will probably do this more and more in the future because there is a lot of these very textured walls all over this house, and it's just going to get more and more complicated as I start building more rooms. Once I had the papers in place, I wanted to paint the edges with just a little bit of gray paint. This is just some gray craft paint, just so if you do see any of these, you won't really just notice that it's white foam board that you can see. Now it's time to put in the fireplace, the moment that I have been waiting for, that maybe you have been waiting for. I really do want to focus on the floors soon because it is driving me crazy not having a nice dark finished floor when I'm working on these walls. But for now, my black cardstock will work. Here is how the fireplace wall looks once it's snapped in place. I do need to do a little bit of aging on the walls, but I think it's looking really great. And here is the green light glowing, which is making me so very happy. Yes, this is definitely what I wanted to see. Yes, I am aware it is no longer Christmas. However, it is cold and Catherine O'Hara, so I think it works. I finished up the fireplace area and I installed the 2 extra pieces of wallpaper so that this wall is somewhat complete. I'm still going to have to age it in the future and add some sconces, but thankfully Delia's tastes are pretty minimal, so there's not a ton of stuff I have to make for the walls. And now it's time to focus on the tiny little wedding officiant that comes out of the fireplace during the wedding scene of the movie. I'm going to be using paper clay to create him, and it's one of my favorite clays to work with. A lot of people prefer polymer clay, and I think some of the same techniques can be used in either clay. I'm not quite sure why I like paper clay, but I do want to tell you a few things that I will be doing along the way that are just easier to tell you now so that I don't have to say it every time I do it during the sculpting process. Paper clay is an air dry clay, so every time I want to save my progress, all I need to do is put it in front of a fan for about 20 minutes and that will harden the surface of the clay. I still wouldn't trust it, like push on the clay at that point, but it will keep me from putting fingerprints and other marks into the clay. The other thing I will be doing is adding on new clay onto already dried clay. Whenever I do this, I'm just adding a little bit of water to the previously dried surface, and then I can add clay right on top of that, and it makes it easier for the clay to stick. I will be doing both of those things a lot during this process, so I just wanted to explain them to you now. You can kind of tell which clay has been dried by the color of it. Dry clay is white and the wet clay has kind of a grayish look to it. With that out of the way, let's get sculpting. For this project, I'm going to be using DOS brand paper clay. I'm not quite sure if I'm saying that correctly. I've been told I'm not saying it correctly in the past, but it's DAS. And I'm going to be using just a wood pole that's about the right size of the Officiant that I want to create. And then I'm just using some cheap aluminum foil to build out his shape. He does have quite a unique shape, and so I'm making sure to reference the movie clips or movie stills of how he looks, and he has kind of like broad shoulders, a really oversized head, and then his body kind of gets smaller as it gets towards his feet, which is very indicative of Tim Burton's style of characters. This was kind of painful, but I felt like I made his head a little bit too big, so I was cutting down some foil with an X-Acto knife. Once I was happy with the shape, I'm just using some hot glue to glue all the pieces together. I knew his fingers were going to be somewhat difficult because they're very long and bony, and I thought the paper clay would be a little bit too brittle to do that with. So to make sure they're strong, I'm going to be using some Christmas hook wire to make an armature for each hand. I'm making sure there are 5 fingers and then a part that goes out for the arm. I am just kind of loosely wrapping them together, and then I'm using hot glue to make sure that they stay in place and don't come unwrapped. And then I'm going to be filling out the arm with some foil just to make sure it has a nice thickness. I'm not going to be adding any thickness to the fingers because they do need to be long and thin. I'm going to be adding the arms to either side of the body with hot glue. This, of course, is not the greatest way to glue things together all the time because it could come off, but once I have the clay over the pieces, they will be permanently bonded. Once the arms were attached, I could get a better feel for his size and proportions, and I did see that his fingers needed to be a little bit shorter. They weren't that long. And so then I could bend his arms into place because he's supposed to be holding a book as he comes out of the fireplace. So this is all just getting prepared for the sculpting part. A lot of sculpting is making sure you have a really good armature ready to go. When using any type of paper clay, I always make sure to have a little bowl of water because that is what's going to help smooth everything out, and it's also going to help attach clay to clay. To begin, I'm just going to put a thin layer of clay over his entire body. This is going to help smooth everything out and give me a surface to start working on. I'm going to let this dry, and this is permanently going to attach the arms so I don't have to worry about the hot glue coming loose and the arms falling off. Then I can work on filling out some pieces that need a little bit more thickness. His arms were just a little bit too thin, so I'm adding some clay along the arms to make them thicker. Each time I do this, I'm going to make sure and blend the new clay into the old clay that I had already put on. I'm either going to do this with a sculpting tool, which it's easier to work in smaller areas with a sculpting tool, but when I get to a bigger area like the back or the legs, it is easier to use my finger. So as you can see here, the sculpting tool is leaving little lines, but if I just use my finger, it goes a lot smoother. Thankfully, with this guy, I don't have to worry about being too symmetrical because his design is just not very symmetrical. So he was a fun one to create. I can go along with my theory of sculpting characters, which is just kind of move clay around until it looks right, which doesn't always end up in symmetry, but does work for the wedding officiant here. Moving forward, I needed to make sure that he could stand up. I wanted to try and get his balance pretty early in the sculpt. So I made a large disc of clay and then squished his body into that disc and started sculpting shoes. He is going to have rather large feet, and this is because I do want him to stand on his own. His pants are going to make his legs look a little bit more proportional with his feet. I am going to bulk out the sides of his legs, and then I'm going to add some extra clay in the center, and this is because I want it to look as though he has a pair of pants on. And to do that, I'm going to sculpt into the wet clay and make a partition between the two sides of the pair of pants. While the clay was still wet, I was able to add some wrinkles, and I do think maybe I went a little overboard with the wrinkles in his pants, but I think it's a fun idea that his pants are just way too big for him because he has kind of a fitted jacket and then he has just really wrinkly pants. I don't know. I just think this guy is really cute, and the oversized pants kind of make me laugh and may not be screen accurate to this guy, but I enjoyed creating it. To create the hem of the pants or the bottom of the pant leg, I'm just using a snake of clay and I'm draping that over the top of the shoe. Then I can use a sculpting tool to blend that snake into the rest of the pants, and this will give it a finished but very droopy look over the top of the shoes. So far he's balanced, so I'm going to continue to check that as I'm sculpting on him because his head does end up being very large. Now I'm going to be working on the suit top. I'm going to be first creating the opening of the suit, and to do this I'm cutting the pieces on my mat before I add it onto my sculpture. This is going to be a lot easier to do it this way. I am giving him a tie. It's a little bit long, but that's okay, I can cut it off. And I'm just going to be adding water to the existing clay in order for it to stick. I cut off the bottom of the tie and then blended it into the rest of his body because it will be hidden inside the suit. Then I can take the two pieces that I cut on my mat, lay them over the tie, and then line the top edges up with the top of his shoulders. And here's the beginning of our suit. Now I can just take off any excess that I don't need. It's pretty easy to cut into this clay and remove it. And then I'm going to blend the rest of it into his arms and his body. Next, I'm going to be creating the bottom of the suit jacket. This, I just need one clean edge, and I'm going to start at the very bottom opening of the jacket, making sure I have somewhat of a 90-degree angle. I'm going to wrap it around part way. The reason I'm not going all the way around is because I do want him to have coattails, and so I'm just going to do part way, and then the back part of the coat is actually going to droop down. So right now he looks like he has kind of a sweater on, but hopefully by the end of it, it will look like a suit jacket. I'm going to create the coattails separately, and to do this I'm just making a U-shaped piece, and then I am going to split it in the center and add it onto the back of his jacket. As I add the piece, I'm just going to again blend it into the back, just making sure that everything looks smooth. Luckily this guy is pretty lumpy, so smooth is kind of a relative term here, but I am trying to keep it fairly smooth. After all that is blended together, we do have a bottom hem on our suit jacket, so it's time to move to the top of the jacket. I'm going to be adding these triangle-shaped lapels to either side of his neck, and all I did was find one shape that I thought worked really well, and then I cut out a second in clay so that I had two that matched before applying them to the sculpt. That way I didn't have to try and figure out how I cut the first one and try to match it. So here's how they look once they're applied. They don't need to be blended very much because I do want them to stand out against the coat. Then it was time to do a base layer over his head. So finally we get to, well, I don't know if it's going to be really an improvement, but we're going to cover his head, his aluminum head, with some clay. One of the most distinctive features of his face are his large eye sockets. So I'm starting with those by creating a snake of clay, and I'm going to try and get it the general shape that they need to be and then smooth it into his face. I do realize at like a later time in this sculpting process that these eyes are too small, and I'll show you how I fix them when I get to that point, but I do think at this moment I should have made them a lot bigger. But for the time being, I am trying to make somewhat matching eyes. Again, they don't have to be perfectly symmetrical because that's not the nature of his face, but I do want them to be around the same size and somewhat similar shapes. I felt like his head needed to go back a little further. It does kind of look like it hangs over the back of his jacket, which is weird to say about a head, but I'm adding a bit of clay on the back and then smoothing it in, trying to make sure that I keep that definition between the plane of his back and the bottom of his head. His head is not perfectly round, so I am making a few dents here and there and then smoothing them with some water and my finger. Then it was time to add on his nose. Noses are always so fun, but then also difficult. And that's because noses can really define a face. So you can either make or break a face with the nose. I always start by making a teardrop shape and then adding it right in between the eyes. I'm going to smooth the top of the teardrop into the forehead and allow the nose or the bottom of the teardrop to hang down below. I'm going to smooth that down into where the upper lip will eventually be, and then I'm going to start to shape the nose. His nose does look fairly small and triangular. Once I get it to the right shape, I poke some nostrils in and then just go back and add little details such as wrinkles or just making sure that I didn't deform the nose when I added the nostrils. I'm going to be adding what kind of looks like a comically large mouth, but I do end up blending most of this clay in, so in the end you won't look like this. This was a really interesting face to try and sculpt, thankfully, because it is kind of a weird one. If I messed up little details here and there, I still got the main point across by the time I got done sculpting this face. So if you want to try it, highly suggest it. It was at this point that I realized his eyes were too small, and part of the reason was because his face was too thin. I think it was long enough, but it was too thin. So I added this flattened snake of clay that went from under each eye over his forehead and underneath the other eye, and I'm going to start blending that in to give me a wider area where I can start adding more to the eyes. And every time I add clay around the eye area, I start adding more and more wrinkles. So it looks like these eye sockets have several layers of wrinkles starting from the inside and getting bigger. And really it'll come down to when I paint it, what parts of it will actually look like the eye socket. So here you can see I'm adding another snake of clay, and this is really just going above the eye, so it kind of looks like extended eye, like where his eyebrows would be. And then again, I'm adding more wrinkles. So really there's maybe 3 layers of this eye socket going out and getting bigger. But in the end, I'm much happier with the eye size now, and I think it's much more proportional. Moving on to the hands, instead of covering these wires with paper clay, which I think could easily crack and break, I decided to cover the wires with wood glue because it does like to kind of clump up. I thought it would look like bony fingers. So I added layers of wood glue just to see how it would work, and I did a couple layers in the end, and this is how it turned out. I really love the creepy long fingers, and I think it worked perfectly for this guy. Once I was happy with the hands, I knew I could finish up the jacket, which included finishing up any parts of the arms that I felt like needed to be filled out, and then I could add the cuffs. Oh, but first I needed to add a pocket because I went back and watched the scene again, and it does look like he has a little pocket. Everyone loves pockets, so I had to make sure that he had his. And then it was time to do the cuffs, which could go around the hands or the areas where I added the wood glue. This is just a little rectangle of clay that I wrap around the arm, and then I do that on both sides so it does finish off the jacket and give it that more formal look. He is going to a wedding, after all. Once I was done with the sculpting process, I did want him to dry thoroughly, so I put him to the side and started to work on the book. In the movie, it looks like the book is supposed to resemble a Bible, but I really don't know what book it is, so I am going to just be making a generic book that is bound in something that looks like black leather. So here we go. After all I created this week, I really was thinking about taking the shortcut, which would have been to take an existing book and paint it and change it to what I wanted it to be. However, this book did feel like it was just slightly too big for him, so I realized I was going to have to make one anyway, so I am going to do that. This is a leather-like material that I have just made by putting Mod Podge, glossy Mod Podge, over some black fabric. It's really easy to make and it works really well as miniature leather because it's a lot thinner than real leather would be. I traced over the book, and not because I want it to be the same size, but just so I could get the general shape of an open book. And I'm going to cut into the edges, because I'm going to turn the edges over to make the edge of the book cover. It's kind of hard to see anytime I make anything with black fabric. It's so hard to capture on video, but all I'm doing is folding over the edges and then gluing them down so I have the start of a book cover. Then I can fold it to the general book shape, and I'm ready to start working on the pages. I have some vellum that I've really never used, but it's perfect for dollhouse books because vellum is really, really thin. I'm going to be cutting this to the shape of the size that I think the pages should be. I'm stacking them and then clamping them down so that I can add glue to the edges. This is going to give the other edge a very loose feel, so you can tell that the pages are individual. So I'm putting the glued edge onto the inside of the book. I should have made the pages a little bit wider. There's a little bit too much space in between where the book is open, and you will be able to see once I add the folded pages that are going to lay on top. Now, you would normally be able to cover this up or really not notice this, but you will see the book from the front, and you can see these gaps between the top pages that are going to cover everything up and the two side pages. So I could have done the pages all over again to try and help that, but instead I decided to do the lazy thing, which was just glue some little strips of paper on the inside, cross my fingers, and hope nobody noticed. Now, vellum is see-through, so when I start adding this glue, you will be able to see through the pages and see the glue, but as I add more and more pages on top, it will start covering up that glue, and when I get to the very top page, I add the smallest amount of glue, so you really can't tell that there's that much glue inside the book. I think my cover-up of my mistake worked pretty well, and really you will only notice it if you know where to look. So now that my book's done and my wedding officiant is all dry, I can go ahead and start the painting process. Just like the fireplace mantle, he's going to get a completely black base coat, so I'm starting with a pretty dark base. I am going to paint back in a little bit of white because you can see that he has a white shirt underneath his suit. The hands do make it a little bit difficult to get to these detail areas, but it is possible. Anywhere I mess up with the white, I can just go back with the black paint and clean it up. For his skin color, it's a gray, which feels like this entire project has just been a lot of gray, but that's okay, I like gray. I'm going to be dry brushing over his head, making sure that you can still see a lot of that black base coat shining through, especially in his eye sockets and in a lot of the deep wrinkles. Also, his mouth is going to be very dark. His head was probably the easiest to paint, but it ends up looking like one of the most detailed areas. I'm using the same technique on his hands, and I'm not worrying about if I get any of the gray paint on the coat because I can go back and cover that up later. I'm going to be adding just a little bit of white on highlight areas such as nose, cheek, and the top of the lip. I think I add a little bit to the top of his head as well. This is just really going to help those features of his stand out. Then I'm going to go back with my black paint and cover up any mistakes I made on the coat. I did notice he has a really nice edge outline to his suit, which I do not like painting straight lines with acrylic paint and a paintbrush. I'm not the greatest at it, but I am going to try and give him his dapper coat as best as I can. Once those lines are finished, I can go back with a very dry brush with just a little bit of gray paint on it. I'm going to go over the coat and the pants. This is going to give just a little bit of highlight on the wrinkles and make it look like a fabric that's been inside of a fireplace. And then also I'm going to shine his shoes, make sure they're nice and shiny because, you know, he likes to take care of his appearance. So here is his book. I think he's looking pretty good. I'm pretty excited about the results, and I'm very ready to get him in front of his fireplace. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I do have one house to show you that was sent in. Thank you so much to everybody who has sent in a house for the attic diorama. If you still want to participate, I will put the information in the description box below so you can figure out how you can send one in as well, if you want to. I had the wedding officiant help me display the house, and in that process I thought, there's so many other things he could hold. So yeah. I will not be gluing in the book because that was so cute. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to leave me a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Which is a lot less. We definitely need to add a chalk mark to Beetlejuice. 2 lines of progress. Lowering the desk. 2 lines. And that's it!